Videos with us again. I hope everybody had a good break. I like to welcome those who are joining us new today, and our next panel is almost ready, I believe, to pick up from here and to moderate our third session. I'd like to introduce Stephanie Pincetl, who is a professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, at the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. And she's the founding director of the California Center for Sustainable Communities at UCLA. And she will moderate this next session, and will be from the global focusing into more local, and we'll be talking about Southern California a little bit more at its specifics. So thank you all, and Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I'm sorry I wasn't able to meet with you earlier. I was taking my grandchildren and my daughter-in-law to the airport. They were going to go see her family in Germany, even though it's full lockdown. So been in a little bit of a panic to get here right on time and them on time. And so it'll take me a couple minutes to just kind of immerse myself in all of this. But I'm very, very happy to be here. And I want to compliment the organizers for putting together a session a day that is extremely important and also extremely timely as we transition back to so-called normal, and what the stresses and strains are of that life that we longed for, but at the same time, when you're trying to navigate through traffic to get to someplace on time and back on time, you realize there was something to a slightly less stressful life. So the panelists today include Sarah Graham, who has graciously offered her house and her property up in, I'm going to forget the name, very close to Santa Barbara. Sarah, please remind me the name of it.
Yes, Santa Ynez.
And Santa Ynez, thank you. If I'd been a little bit more less anxious, I would have remembered that. And who has really set a vision for living on the land and providing an opportunity for people to come up and enjoy that, that place that she's developed in very interesting ways, but also to contemplate issues of humans and nature, humans and wildlife. I'd also like to introduce Frank Davis, who is extremely renowned academic from UC Santa Barbara, who's worked on issues of biodiversity and conservation in California for a very long time, and who's done some of the pioneering work on mapping and assessing ecosystem viability. So I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to interact with Frank, whom I should have had an opportunity to interact with previously, but I haven't. So it's the first time is a really good time. And finally, and not least, Jonathan Ocon, who's a PhD student in geography at UCLA, who I have the extreme pleasure of being on the dissertation for, who brought to my class in the fall wealth of insights and interesting comments around the question of humans and nature, or humans and the other and living beings in urban environments. So
did we lose Stephanie? Hello, everyone.
Oh,
Here she is.
Sarah, did you hear me?
No, I had a block out.
Okay. Well, I wondered if you would be willing to start off the panel.
No problem at all. All right, let me do a share screen. PowerPoint. Open share. And let's get it going, which is Come on, start slideshow. Play from start. All right, working. First of all, thank you. Thank you very much for including me. I've known Eladia for 10 million years, and I've been really excited about the development of this entire operation that she has magically made create around the world. And so it's really fun to be part of it. I would like to offer for discussion an ongoing project. It's a ranch in Santa Ynez, California, that we like to call almost off-grid. It's based on a circular economy and a circular ecology. This is a 10-acre parcel with open land, with assorted barns and residential buildings, but largely open space. And it houses a menagerie of interrelated species, 12 people, 18 horses, 20 chickens, 3 dogs, 2 cats, not to mention the assorted wildlife that regularly wanders onto the premises. Many of the rest of you are focusing on the wildlife, but I'm going to look at the interrelation of species that are domestic and how we all work together. The ranch is powered by the sun with a 22 kilowatt array of photovoltaic panels. We use the utility network as our power bank, which is not unusual, but it's efficient. All the rainwater is collected. It's used for irrigation, and then it's channeled back through the existing topography to replenish the natural aquifer. We then draw back from the aquifer with a well that provides all of our water. The horses produce tons of manure, which is composted before being distributed back onto the fields and gardens. So each of these is a circular system, and collectively it's, shall I say, a larger circular system. Crops. As a matter of principle, when we got the property, I decided that everything we plant should be edible. Besides the horse facilities on the land, we produce fruit, vegetables, nuts, olives, eggs, and herbs for humans, as well as grass and hay as animal fodder. Any surplus food that is not consumed by us, by the residents and our friends, is donated to a local food bank, which also gives me great pleasure to do so because we can, and it's frankly fun to do so. If I look back at the site model, you see different elements on the property. We have the food crops, orchards, the well, water recycling, chickens, the septic, which of course is another circular system since it fertilizes the pastures, the PV array and communications, and compost. So these are the elements that make up the thing. And then this building, which was a barn, was our first construction project, and it was testing just how cheaply the process of building can be. So because we're architects, we make things, so that's very much part of our thinking. Here we took an existing horse barn. We transformed it into a live-work space for humans using available on-site materials as well as the cheapest possible industrial and agricultural supplies that were sourced as locally as possible, with the modus operandi of the entire design investigation being 99 cents. This involved a material shuffle of bits and pieces of existing buildings, whether that be mesh panels or walls for the horse stalls or gates, shelter walls. These were all existing prefabricated barn elements. And so it was quite easy to actually move them around and quite efficient. And again, a lot of fun to do so. So out of that, we created a space. We added a very simple kitchen and bath to make it habitable. In doing so, we were searching for the most affordable and environmentally sound products, again, from agricultural and light industrial catalogs. And it became a wonderful experiment. The structure, which is again, the essential structure was there. It's a prefabricated barn. It's so simple and it's so direct that it begs the question of why habitable spaces for humans need to be so heavy, so complicated, and so costly. I mean, one answer is building codes, but I still challenge why. Here we have a structure that was $25 a square foot. It's nothing. This is a series of shots of the openings in the building that are based on a series of layers, from sliding translucent to sliding clear doors made by a local welder to insulated curtains. So again, it's so light and it's so simple, but it became fresh and fun. And our research again was really looking at how low can you go. So the siding is $1 something a square foot. The Mylar curtains are 15 cents a square foot. Later, they of course became important in the politics of the Trump border wall, both because they're the insulating properties of these are used in shelters and was picked up again by a protest movement. But we were doing it for the pure efficiency of it all. And again, more materials. We have the curtains. The drawers were made of cardboard. The light fixture in the bathroom, I was thrilled to realize you could put in a light fixture for 50 cents because that's all you need. The toilet paper rolls, a simple aluminum tube, the list goes on. So I can't really count my time in the research, but it really became fascinating about how simple can we do things. So here's the space, and it's quite rich in its variability of use, whether it's drawing herbs, unloading bales of hay, a place for John to stay during his 2-week residency, and I can't wait to hear what he came up with while he was here. So you see John's bed on your left, and then this was in the schoolhouse for the kids who live on the ranch during the pandemic. And it was also where we've had parties, including their family weddings. It's also a place for making art, including this magnificent film that was made by it that we've shown in various galleries in Europe by Jenny Rodenhouse in Los Angeles. So the whole thing has been a lot of fun. We also built a new house that similarly does more with less. It's a collection of indoor and outdoor spaces, 3 terraces, 2 living units, 1 workspace that are assembled under a large roof. And the building has various degrees of transparency and opacity. The house is plugged into the off-grid systems of the ranch, so back to our circular systems. It's powered by the sun. It's heated and cooled by the water from the well through a radiant in-floor system. Just a couple of points on the construction. We were thinking minimally. We kept the material flows to a minimum. So no grading was done, no dirt was brought in or out. The roof is a large umbrella lifted slightly off of the roof construction, which protects the building from sunlight. The roof is sloped to channel rainwater to a cistern at one end that's used for irrigating the garden. So the house became part of the same set of systems we were working with throughout. The interior is to some large degree constructed with standard farm tech products and exposed in construction materials that have been tweaked for, of course, aesthetics, but also for environmental performance. So we have the house viewed from the neighbor's vineyard. The house is part of the landscape, and this is part of the vegetable garden. The whole project has been a mosaic of ideas and solutions and tests. We've connected things that are not always connected. And we've tried to reconsider what a contemporary ranch can be as a shared habitat for humans and non-humans alike. The whole project is an experiment in a circular economy and a circular ecology. And that's my simple introduction to the project. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm sure that we'll have a lot of subsequent questions. I'm myself very curious to know how you dealt with the county code. But that is perhaps a different question, but maybe not. Code, as you alluded to, can really preclude a lot of creative ideas. Frank, would you be ready to go next by any chance?
Ken, I'll just have to share my screen. Sarah, if you can unshare yours.
I'm trying to. What have I done wrong? Let's see. How do I unshare you? There we go.
There you go. So actually, Sarah, thank you for that presentation. What a cool project. And I think I have a couple of points to make. I only have a handful of slides. I'm looking forward to our discussion. But the first point will be that if we are going to have a coexistence of humans and wild species in Southern California, restoration has to be on the table. I mean, it has to be part of the discussion. And then I'm going to make the point that with climate change in our present and our future, it's not so much just coexistence, but we have to recognize a codependence between wild species and humans. They're going to be codepending on us as much as we depend on them. And in some ways, that's sort of like your project in Santa Ynez, where you have a lot of codependent species occupying a small place. So I'll see if I can explore those themes with you. I really want to thank the organizers. I've had a terrific time and enjoyed these fascinating presentations and discussions today. It's really been fun. I'm going to just, first of all, for those of you who haven't spent time in Southern California, make a point with this slide that it is an incredibly diverse place. It is diverse in terms of geodiversity, topography, geology, soils, local climates. It's a place that's had rapid evolutionary diversification in the last couple of million years. So between all that physical diversity and biological diversification, it is a hotspot biologically of global significance. It is also a place that supports 28 million people, how many people is that? About 23 million residents, and a number of other activities that are culturally rich, but they have demanded a lot of the air, of the land, and of the water resources in this region. And so it is a region that is probably not sustaining itself now in terms of its water, its air, its biological diversity for sure. So we're at this kind of a zone of conflict between some of our conservation and coexistence goals and the economic goals of Southern California and the cultural goals of Southern California. I will say that there is hope because I think actually many of the systems that are really in dire need of restoration over the last 40 years, we have developed a lot of very good science to help us understand how to restore those systems. And I'll just give you one example. The wetland and freshwater systems of California are probably the most diminished of all of our ecosystems. There's probably 5% of what was originally in California still here. But we can actually recover these systems. This is a view of Coal Oil Point near the UCSB campus. In the background, you can see Santa Cruz Island, the Santa Barbara Channel. In the foreground, you can see some residential development in Goleta, and you see the western edge of the UC Santa Barbara campus. And in the center of the image, you see a 9-hole golf course, about 30 hectares. It was created by scraping the soil from the surrounding area and filling up a tidal marsh about 50 years ago. 10 years ago, the campus with a bunch of partners decided, as part of some housing mitigation of its own, to restore that golf course back to a tidal wetland. And 10 years later, that's what it looks like. And it's a really spectacularly successful project. It's still in the early stages. You can see they actually excavated out the golf course and put a lot of the soil back where it came from in the first place, and then a lot of aggressive revegetation and so forth. I use it as an example to say where there is a will, there is the science and there is a way. And this is a very cool place now that serves a lot of different functions, both for wildlife and for wild plant species, for fish spawning habitat, but also as a wonderful place for social interactions and education. So the community engagement in these kinds of projects is a key part of their success in my own mind. Now, I don't work in wetlands. I work in places like this when I do my field research. Sarah, this is right up the road from you. And in fact, it was in your background shot of your opening slide. This is the part of the Sedgwick Reserve, just north of Santa Ynez. And the system I work in is these mixed oak woodlands and savannas that are also a target for a lot of restoration work in California at this point. And I use this as just a quick example of how there's this notion of codependence and how our our relationship with these species has changed through time. So in this picture, you see two different oak species, the evergreen coast live oak, and it's a January shot. So the valley oak is the deciduous oak that you see intermingled there with the evergreen oaks. The Sedgwick Reserve, it's a UC natural reserve. I've been doing an experiment there for about 25 years on oak restoration. The valley oak is just one of the most wonderful organisms in California. It's quite iconic. They live, they may be the longest lived oak in North America. They can live to be 500 or 600 years old, and they can be immense. But I use this as an example of a changing kind of relationship. If you look historically at the Native American use of this species, it was a key part of their survival in these oak woodland systems. I love this picture by Kat Anderson, who is an anthropologist who studied the sort of stewarding of native biodiversity and management by the Native Americans in California. And from the single valley oak species alone, she just shows all of the different pieces of the oak that supported that culture and their survival and their well-being over many millennia. Not just wood, but branches and sprouts and fungi and burls and so forth. It was a provisioning tree, in other words, it was a provisioning species. It is no longer a provisioning species, and it hasn't been for over 200 years in our culture in California. We use the understory for livestock production. We turn many of the lands now into wine grape production, but it is no longer the trees themselves that provide any provisioning services. They have become, and they still are, really important, as you said, Sarah, for wildlife. This is the most diverse of the wildlife habitats in California, these oak woodlands. But mainly, they've been used for rural development, for urban development, and for suburban development. So it's kind of ironic that the image you see here is of 1,000 Oaks city in Southern California. And they have become very much a symbol and an icon of California's sort of wealth and prosperity and well-being. But it's a funny kind of symbolic relationship we have with these oaks at this point. We do care about them. We want to coexist with them. I love this little image of the oak in the urban park that's been all propped up with stilts, and we're going to keep that oak going as long as we can. But the point is, it's a kind of a coexistence without a codependence, the way we've built our relationship with these oaks over the last couple of centuries. I think that is beginning to change as we think about the carbon value of oaks, the sequestration values, the sort of microclimate values for urban green infrastructure and so forth. There may be a shift. My assertion is that it's going to have to be even more than that. It's going to be more than coexistence and live and let live. We have policies that are live and let live policies. What we don't have is a way to help a lot of these species cope with rapidly changing climates. And so that suddenly exposes them to the need for migration, for movement, for gene flow that they're not able to do in highly fragmented environments and so forth. And so we have to think our way through what is the sort of how will their future depend on our understanding of their ecology needs. And I'll give you just one example. I think the upper right shows you something you know about California's warming climate has made us more fire prone. Well, these oaks used to be managed by the Native Americans with wildfire for a variety of reasons. We haven't had fire in these systems for a couple of centuries. We need to understand how you can build more climate resilient and fire resilient oak woodlands and restore. So we're actually doing research out at Sedgwick. This is an experimental burn we did that last fall, actually. But this is the kind of work we have underway now. And I simply make the point that we may be looking at assisted genetic migration, assisted dispersal, intense management of these habitats to allow these species. So it creates us an interesting kind of different relationship. It goes from being exploitation or coexistence, live and let live, to codependence, where we recognize our dependence on these organisms for our own survival, but also we need to think about their depending on us and our active management to help them through a climate transition. So I'll stop there and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, that was inspiring, and I have lots of questions myself. And then let's move to John, and then we'll open it up for live questions. Is that right, Ilaria?
Yes, sure. Or also among the speakers,
the panelists, yeah.
Come to ask each other's questions.
Very good, thank you. So.
John, are you able to share your screen?
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm trying that right now. Sorry, I have a weird setting on my laptop. I'm going to.
Do you want Richard to share it, or you're good?
I should be able to get this going.
John, you're the youngest one. You should be the fastest at this.
I should be, right? All right, let's try this.
It's the pressure of 3 professors on the panel with him.
That is so true. Okay, let's try this. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Well, that was wonderful. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Frank. I really enjoyed your presentations, and hopefully my presentation will be able to feed off some of the themes that the two of you brought up, and hopefully lead to a nice discussion. I'm going to be talking primarily about my time spent in Santa Ynez on Sarah's property, and so I just want to thank Sarah and Mark Angelo for opening up their hospitality and allowing me to sort of work through some research questions and some research ideas on this theme of coexistence and interdependence between species. And so we'll just go ahead and jump into it. Personally, I'm a PhD student coming from the UCLA Department of Geography, and I primarily use observational methods in my research. First off, I love remote sensing of the environment using satellite or airplane imagery to sort of monitor and analyze landscapes. I'm very, very much interested in socio-ecological questions, this sort of dependence between humans and the environment. And what can we sort of infer or correlate from these images captured either kilometers above the surface or all the way up into near Earth orbits? What kind of questions come out of this? And so for the residency, I proposed using remote sensing alongside species modeling to sort of understand bobcat response to human altered landscapes, primarily spanning the last 20 years. I think a real strength of using remote sensing is being able to do these really large time scale analyses, because we have imagery going back to the 1980s and seeing how things changed, either previously or to set up experiments looking forward towards the future and watching things change in real time. And I chose the bobcat primarily because it's an opportunistic predator. It doesn't really discriminate on types of landscapes and will target whatever prey. And so I figured, okay, in a human-dominated area, what sort of landscape changes can we actually measure? Can we actually see changes within the response from the bobcat itself? Kind of beginning to understand design choices and land use legacies and their impact on animals' use of space. And another thing that I wanted to pair with the remote sensing was volunteer geographic information. And this is primarily anyone, scientist, non-scientist, observing an animal and documenting that using their phone, social media, or using sort of community science platforms such as iNaturalist or some other platform that's built for these types of observations, where people can submit a photo they took, append some geographic coordinates to it and be like, I think I saw a bobcat at this place in this point in time. And that information can be really useful, especially when building species distribution modeling.
Sorry to interrupt you.
I'm sorry?
I don't know if it's just me. I don't see your slides advancing. I don't know if it's just me.
Oh,
sorry.
I'm sorry.
Do you guys advancing, or is just me?
Are you still on the title slide?
Yes.
Yeah, we're still on the title slide. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That's okay. It was a really good discussion.
Yeah, you were sorry to interrupt it, but
no worries.
Yeah, if you can match the slide to where you are, don't start again, but sorry, I just wanted to.
Yeah, no worries, no worries. Thank you for letting me know.
I was just mesmerized by the discussion. Didn't even think the slides needed to advance.
Okay. Yeah, this is, sorry, I got, somehow my sharing is paused and I don't know. Let's try this again, everyone. Okay, is this a different slide?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. We're just going to try it from this then. Okay, so this was the slide in which I was talking about my preferred methods and using remote sensing. And so hopefully this can give you a sort of visual representation of satellite imagery or airplane imagery and sort of what information we can get from that. You can see the coarse resolution. Each one is used in a different setting, but whoops. Did it change for y'all?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. This is where I left off. This was the last slide that I was actually talking. And so again, wanting to model an animal response to human altered landscapes and seeing if we can do that using remote sensing imagery and volunteer geographic information. And so this was my intention coming into the residency. And I was really excited to get to know the landscape and to actually see it. It's one thing to observe a landscape from an image taken by a satellite or from an image that could have been taken anywhere in the world, and developing some sort of computer model or algorithm to analyze that image based on existing science. But it's a completely different thing to actually be there on the ground and experience the landscape. And so that's what this residency really allowed me to do. And within that first week, my first impressions completely changed. You know, I was looking at, I went into this area with a preconceived notion of like a rural stereotype. You know, I'm a city boy, I don't spend much time in the country. And so I came with this preconception and just in my first few days exploring the landscapes, you realize that it is heavily dominated by these accepted land uses. It has a theme, it has a targeted audience or a targeted resident or a targeted land use. And here it was, you know, rows of vineyards. It was rows of horse stables. Business owners that I had a pleasure of getting to know and talk and got to interview and ask questions, became very apparent to me that at least from those I communicated with, you know, this is, you know, a second home for a lot of people from Los Angeles, or a popular place to visit for tourists to do wine tastings or horseback riding. And so I started toying with the idea of, okay, we're getting some of these land use legacies, we're bringing them to the surface. And this is probably what I'll be able to capture with the remote sensing imagery. We can actually see these changes from the last 30 years, but looking at how these areas are actually designed, you know, you see a lot of fences, a lot of barbed wire, a lot of design choices that are meant to control movement. They're meant to grant or deny access. And I started thinking, okay, are these things that can be measured? Are these things, or what are the impacts of these design choices on local biodiversity, such as bobcats or coyotes or anything else that isn't domesticated or isn't preferred? And so here, you know, I'm living in an area where, you know, there is this codependence, like Frank said. You know, you have horses, you have these bird houses that you find on every vineyard there that are meant to attract birds to want to build a nest. And the idea is that they'll help with your pest control for your vines. And so there is this sort of relational, this relationship between humans and domesticated or preferred wildlife. And so I started thinking, okay, does this coexistence exist only where it's economical? Is there a sort of preferential coexistence that exists today? And I think one of the more important questions was, well, you know, we're interested here on interdependence or a coexistence among all animals. We're looking towards more environmental designs. We're looking more towards environmental stewardship through restoration projects or, you know, ecological sciences. And so where does all this research, where do these methodologies fit in to where we want to go? How do we get from here to there? And so I began to reflect on my own intention. I began to reflect on my own proposed methodologies. And I'm going, okay, well, where are some of these relationships? You know, what becomes blind to remote sensing? What becomes blind to observational methods? And so I started doing some research on bobcats specifically, and came across annual harvests, and realizing that because these are species of least concern, they're not endangered, hunters are allowed to go on and cull maybe hundreds of bobcats every single year. Obviously, there are some codes and there's some restrictions on how they can be hunted or what is needed for them to be hunted, but due to their healthy numbers, you know, every year sport hunters get to go out there and kill bobcats. Began to realize, you know, this is something that would affect a species distribution model that wouldn't show up in volunteer geographic information. It wouldn't show up in the remote sensing imagery. And so you begin to think, okay, what are the impacts of direct human involvement or direct human action to the models? You know, a model is never an exact representation of our environment. And so how then do you begin to capture some of these relationships that go beyond maybe some of our ecological approaches? And so I wanted to start thinking, okay, how can we dig deeper? How do we get to the embedded knowledge? How do we get into some of the information that might not be readily available to either geographers or ecologists? How do we then talk to land managers? This is a human-dominated landscape. How do we, you know, tap the knowledge of previous residents? You know, this is previously Chumash land and is now occupied by settlers. And so, you know, when you approach a land manager, when you approach their interaction with the ecosystem, their interaction with bobcats, their interaction with you know, valley oaks, you know, how do we then bring out some of this embedded knowledge, and how can that complement some of our more empirical or observational approaches so that we can get to a more tempered approach to conservation, restoration, or maybe even land use? You know, there's, I think, the question of codes and codified language and standards, and you know, where does that fit into all this? And so this is where my intentions began to shift, and, you know, maybe wanted to establish a more multifaceted approach to the non-human, thinking beyond, you know, how are they beneficial to us, thinking beyond ecosystem services, thinking beyond what can we get from restoration, or what can we get from you know, a coexistence with certain species? You know, how can we form an interdependence with maybe species we hate, maybe species that aren't entirely economically beneficial to us? How do we approach the non-human while tempering our own biases or our own interests? And so I'm interested, for my research, moving on, I'm currently in my examination phase. I'm bringing in all these different literatures, all these different theories. I'm not the first to think about this. And so how are other people approaching this? What have they done? What have they not done? Where are the gaps in this? What is the benefit of building a multi-species narrative? How then can transdisciplinary involvement engage with each other? How can architects and scientists engage with each other, but also work within this ethical space? I think we all bring our own intentions to each of our own projects. We bring our own relevancy. And I think, you know, especially as a scientist in training, there might be some uneasiness with a non-scientist engaging with me, being like, well, you only have your research questions. So how can we co-produce research questions together? And how do you include the non-human into that? How do you then build this ethical space? How do you establish reciprocity? I think it's one thing to have, you know, restoration as a goal, or it's another thing to have a certain land use as a goal, but either one has an agenda. And once a human's involved in that situation, the ecosystem's never going to be the same again. And so how then do we approach this coexistence? How can we get to a more tempered land use decisions? How do we elucidate or show land use legacies and their impact on species? Does science have a role in this? Do non-scientists have a role in this? How do you build that space for people to come and transfer their knowledge, transfer their understanding, and apply it? And so thinking of this, I'm putting together things that I'm familiar with. Remote sensing, something I use. It's visual, it's computational, and it has wide benefits in terms of, you know, looking in the past or establishing experiments to look towards the future, to do change detection without actually needing to be somewhere. Species modeling, another computational approach. It's predictive, it's cartographic. We can get really interesting maps, and I think there's a push now to include a temporal component where and model within three-dimensional space to really understand a species movement through our spaces without looking at like a two-dimensional map, a flat map. And these might be helpful, especially when bringing in local ecological knowledge. You know, this could be oral, written, could be documented, you know, old records, codes, land use permits, or it could be undocumented. Again, you know, something that's passed down ceremoniously from elders to youth. But how do we access this? What is a respectful, what is a relevant way to use this information? How do we engage others? How do we sort of access embedded understandings, and what role does it play within these more computational or empirical approaches? And I would argue that, you know, a combination of these, you know, builds us towards a more than human ethnography. It builds us more towards a comprehensive narrative building among all species, coexistence, codependence, or exploitation focused, such as Frank presented on. And so I leave the question to you guys, you know, is there a better approach than the way we're going about these questions? What might that look like? What are your experiences and such? And so again, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank NAHR. This was a wonderful residency for me to think about my own research approaches, where they fall short in the questions that I'm interested in, and possibly new ways of moving forward and new ways of conducting research or engaging with others on who are interested in approaching shared ecological questions or problems. And again, I want to thank Sarah and Mark for their hospitality. It was wonderful to stay in the 99-cent space. I had a wonderful time getting to know residents, business owners, and just being able to explore the land over 2 weeks in March. So thank you again, everyone.
Thank you. That was a really whirlwind set of presentations, actually. We could have spent an afternoon on each one, discussing them to a greater extent. I have a couple of questions to launch the discussion, perhaps. And I was struck, John, by some of your comments about, at the beginning, how being in place changed the kinds of views you had about the place and the questions you were interested in. And then at the same time, when you were presenting your methods, you talked about being able to do the work without actually having to be there. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was an interesting paradox, actually, because one of the real questions, I think that one of the real things that unite the three of you is understanding of place, being in place. And I think that's something that's absolutely worth exploring. And then the second question is also the dichotomization that we carry around with us about observation. And so what is observation if you're just sitting in place looking at things versus observation from satellite imagery or more formal scientific techniques? Are they really different? Is there a why do we tend to say indigenous knowledge is situated observational knowledge, but scientific knowledge is something different? It's a very peculiar dichotomy to me. So I thought we could, and then I have a third question, and we can go back to it. And this is for Sarah. And I don't mean to put you on the spot at all by this, because it's a question I asked myself. We have a 20-acre orange grove in the east end of Ojai. And in my mind's eye, what I've been doing is planting oaks that sprout from the oaks that are on there consistently every year, 5, 10, 15, between the rows, between the trees, with the ultimate goal of what this would look like before. And I wondered, Sarah, when you're in this landscape, if you have these kinds of thoughts and what that might look like. So those are 3 questions that I think would be interesting to discuss. You can start anywhere you want.
Well, I'd like to, if it's okay with Frank and Sarah, I'd like to address that first question. I think the benefit of remote sensing, or not actually having to be somewhere to experience a phenomenon, is a benefit. It is an observational benefit that we have, but it doesn't need to be mutually exclusive to sort of boots on the ground or being there in person. I think it's a dual approach that can really benefit from each other. And I think in bringing up native science or traditional knowledge, I think there is an openness there to embrace remote sensing and incorporate it within their own situated observational knowledge. Almost, I've heard it described as a, quote, elder in a box, unquote, and sort of being able to adapt to changing ecosystems due to climate change. This situated knowledge is based on millennia's worth of certain patterns. And if those patterns are disrupted, remote sensing could offer a supplementary observational approach to their landscapes or their approach to the land. And so I don't think that it needs to be so much a paradox as something that works in concert with each other.
Frank, do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, I think I tend to think of all of the tools of science, particularly observational science, is about extending our senses and what we're capable of with just our 5 senses. So think about a microscope and how that extends you in one direction. For me, remote sensing is a macroscope in the same way. So we are able to study our planet and as scientists in ways that we simply couldn't do without these additional tools. The other thing I think about with remote sensing and the challenge is you start to look over larger areas, and you just simply can't map your personal experience over to those large spaces. And that's the paradox that I think you really are talking about, Stephanie. In some ways, it's hard to do. So you end up trying to work across multiple scales from your local study sites that you know so well, the home that you live in that you know so well, and you try to scale yourself back out to literally, if you're some kinds of remote sensors, you're doing planetary scale monitoring. So it's a very exciting thing. The other challenge I would say as a scientist is when we start to work at those big scales, we lose the power of the experiment, as you know. And so then you really have to be very clever and do strong inference with lots of different kinds of evidence from you. And that could be deep indigenous knowledge, deep time knowledge. It could be wide space observations and so forth. But it requires the use of very creative inference to do things that you can't do experimentally.
So, Sarah, how do you address this question of knowledge, local knowledge, versus the larger context in which you're
I think that both of you who spoke before are right. I think we need both. And it's a kind of zooming process. Frank put it quite well, but if one is only remote and large scale, then I think you check it by moments of, looking at the ants in the dirt and boots on the ground, and vice versa. And it's not, it's certainly not limited to the field of environmental issues. As architects, we need to. We work around the world, and what we've realized is you can start any project from anywhere, but by the time you're building it, you better be there. And so I think that the back and forth, if we all can remember it, and one can be better at one than the other, but have other team members or allow yourself that testing. But we need both. You need the science and you need being there. And boots on the ground is not only looking at history, but of course that's part of it. And
can I amplify something that Sarah just said? Sorry, Sarah, I didn't mean to cut you off.
You didn't, you're good.
I think this notion that of kind of a network of observers is a really key part of kind of modern science and modern remote sensing and so forth. We actually have now networks of people collecting those boots on the ground kinds of observations that contribute to this ability to scale across from local to continental scale. And that's where synthesis, collaboration, all these kinds of dimensions of science that are really quite exciting are really accelerating. I direct an office for the Long-Term Ecological Research Network, sites all across the US. And it's really interesting to watch people who have deep, intimate knowledge of their own study sites get together and stitch together a view with remote sensing and so forth across much larger regions. So again, it's not just either or, but it's also kind of an interesting collaborative form of science as well.
Funny enough, it is another kind of species interdependency, except you're all human, right? But also the question of, do we want, in the little test of our project, are we trying to restore it back to where it was? No. If I wanted to, and I have huge respect for that, then we first of all would have taken another piece of land that was probably bordering on more wilderness area. Because John, all the photos you took were of the agricultural world. If you rode your bike out another 10 minutes, there wouldn't be as many fences. So of course, it's all gradual. But our experiment here was something quite different. Then restoring, what we're trying to do is restore a kind of balance, but not erase the marks of what humans have done. That'd be another great project.
Well, it's another definition of interdependence, right?
Yeah.
So there's a huge spectrum of interdependence, and we are sometimes blind to the obvious ones that are in our backyard.
When Ilaria asked me to join the panel, at first I thought, I don't fit. What we've done doesn't fit because we're not looking at wildlife. And then I thought, no, there really is a kind of interdependence among what I like to call our menagerie here. And then I became intrigued by looking at it that way.
Well, I'm gonna pose make one more point or question, and then let's turn to other people for sure. I think that one of the big elephants in the room is modernism, and how modernism tends to move towards homogeneity and rationalization of systems, and including in science, right? So we want to make generalizations. National Science Foundation is very happy to fund things that are specific, but you can make big generalizations about for everywhere in the world. And it's like, well, no, that's kind of not the point. But that applies to all kinds of aspects of our existence. And in a sense, Sarah, what you're doing is like counter hegemonic. You're saying, I'm here. I'm absolutely here. And I'm curious to know from the panelists and also from the group at large, you know, how we can amplify that recapturing of place and its specificity against the, you know, all suburbs are built about the same way all across the United States and in China and everywhere else. How do we say, no, wait a second, you can't overpower place by HVAC everywhere? I mean, that's insane. How about where we live? Where's the breeze from? You know, how about a higher ceiling? All these other things. So how do we begin to shift that focus so that we can co-inhabit with place productively and mutually, right? So, because I do think humans can actually, I mean, the way in which Indians burned in California really grew the kind of ecosystem diversity that we inherited, right? And so there's a mutualism there that I think we have lost. And so I'm just curious what the panelists think and then what my fellow participants have on their minds.
I can take a start at that, Stephanie, if you'd like. I think it's a really important question. In terms of the homogenization, I'll point out a nice piece of work by, you probably know this work by Peter Groffman and others, who actually looked at what happens as places urbanize in the US, and they go from more diverse places from the starting point to become more and more like each other over time, biologically and structurally and so forth. And so we've homogenized the urban macro system, as they said, across the US by a lot of our design and culture choices. We would certainly, we're losing a lot along the way in doing that, I think. I think in terms of the sort of the importance of local place, there are two ways that I think about it. One is if you talk to ecologists, they try to say general things and then they end by saying, but it depends. Because it depends on where you are and it depends on the system that you're actually working in. So there's always this sort of sense of place and local texture where I think we're really going to see this full tilt is in climate adaptation work, where the ecology doesn't work theoretically, it has to work locally. It has to be very much tuned to your particular communities and their cultural needs and desires and what the environment's presenting you with in terms of adaptation. So that brings us right back to me anyway, to very, very local ecologies.
And you know, it's obvious, but the word respect has to come in. So, I mean, the whole point of all of these discussions is, I think, that we need to respect other forms of life, as well as, of course, other cultures and so forth, and other places. But the more we can think in that incredibly simple and basic way, that whether we're respecting the wildlife or respecting the land or respecting what came before or the guy next door, that if we really do it, it'll actually lessen the homogeneity. So I'd say let's just all throw it onto our mutual work and it can't hurt.
John.
Yeah, so it's really hard for me to approach this question without leaning heavily from my undergraduate experience in urban planning. And I went to a school that was 50-50 urban planners and 50-50 real estate developers. and realizing that so much of our development is driven by monetization or financialization. What's cheapest, what can be done quickly, and what can be capitalized on. And so it's really hard. I kind of look across the aisle to the real estate developers, and I believe they're the scorn of the earth, you know. And so it's like really hard for me to approach this question. I'm thinking, you know, the planners have the answers, but that's not always true either. And so I think it's the $1 million question, but I have to echo both Frank and Sarah that, you know, this is local based. This depends on, you know, certain local scales. And I really want to echo that respect sentiment there as well.
Anybody want to raise their hand? I can't see everybody, but or just jump in because I think we're at that time.
Well, I have a lot of thoughts and questions myself, obviously, but I'm just waiting. Maybe Clark, I see that you are unmuting yourself. So
yeah, sure.
Yeah. I just wish at some point we address the horses, the retired horses that Sarah is hosting. So maybe we save a minute at some point for the horses. But Clark, please.
Sure, just an observation. Place is the restoration work that I do with our organization started with cultural restoration. And the habitat grew out of that. And both of them always grow out of what I've come to think of as the conventional wisdom, which has a lot of pragmatism thrown in it. And it has a lot of history, and it has a lot of seemed like a good idea at the time. And I've come to think that a lot of our work in any place when we do restoration, and I like to think of it as enhancement, by the way, Sarah brought this up. People don't understand that restoration is not replication. You can't replicate and, you know, pick a prior condition in most places that you can literally put back. But the key phrase that I wanted to put out there for us is, first of all, when we come into a place, it's like we make sure to acknowledge first thing that everyone in the room knows more than we do, if we're not literally of that place. The second thing is we tell them we're there to help them with their conventional wisdom. Right, that's a term that we use, you know, here in English kind of colloquially, but conventional wisdom is two parts, right? It's convention and wisdom. And what we kind of boldly say right off the bat is that you're going to be surprised how much of your wisdom is convention. And so that's the, you know, so you start the respect thing about saying, look, we have this kind of remote sensing perspective because we're not in the community so directly, but by the same token, we can bring that perspective and help them to see what they're engaged with and learn while we're learning about their wisdom, help them to understand the places where maybe it's convention and maybe not so wise anymore. So anyway, those are the thoughts.
Can I just respond quickly to Clark's one comment, which I really appreciate that, Clark. In terms of the restoration rather than replication, I think this is a place where cultural desires meet ecological and economic feasibility. And I think there's a real opportunity there for discussions to rediscover your culture in some ways, the ecology of your culture if it's done properly. So I really think you're right. You're creating something that's not going to be a restoration of the past, particularly under the modern conditions we're in. But it seems to me it's a real opportunity as well.
So if I may call on Deborah, who has had a lot of experience on the front lines here in LA around these questions, do you have any insights you'd like to share?
Well, I'm really listening to this panel, thank you, Stephanie, as a novice in terms of all of the science and technology both John and Frank bring to bear. I was very struck, Jonathan, when you talked about coming to Sarah's ranch and having an idealized sense of rural and realizing it was all fenced in and really quite subdivided. I was very struck by that observation. And I wondered, Frank, how much of that really shows up from remote sensing? I mean, how much would you understand basic subdivisions? And since I deal with a city and the way we divide it, how much really shows up in terms of the environment and remote sensing? Those are subtle subdivisions of the landscape.
I'd say that bird's eye view is not going to capture a lot of the richness of what Sarah described in her project there. You will be able to see, and because remote sensing now is both extensive but also intensive, very high resolution, and you can get 3-dimensional as well as 2-dimensional information and so forth, that one might, if they were analyzing the remote sensing with this in mind, see Sarah's project and say, that's an interesting parcel. You could do that sort of thing, but you'd have to be really designing your analysis with that question in mind. And this is always the challenge with remote sensing is you get out of it what your analytical flow kind of leads you to. You can get a lot of different kinds of information depending on how you do that.
So John, if you were interested in these big cats, could you project what taking out some key fences would do to the environment for these big cats? Can we get to that granularity in terms of trying to reintegrate these species into these human settlements?
Yeah, I think that goes back to what Frank says. I think it comes down to the experiment design. I was hoping that, eventually the research could get there where you're doing some of this high resolution remote sensing and taking away some of this information at the granular level of the land coverage and the land use, and then fine tuning sort of species modeling based on what information you're actually able to get on the ground. And, whether this is coming from sort of presence absence data or whether you can actually tag one of these bobcats and get some telemetry data and see how they interact in real time with the landscape. I think it comes down to the questions you ask and the experiment design that you put together.
Just follow up on bobcats, Jonathan. I don't know if you run into Teresa Nagari's work, but we've had a wonderful time studying bobcats in avocado orchards here in our neck of the woods. So it's one of these interesting places where there's a synergy between human land use activities and a particular set of wildlife species as well.
Definitely.
Well, the issue of boundaries, which is what, of course, fences are about, and bobcats are an interesting cross, because first of all, the bobcats can hop the fences, but how can I say, it becomes local choices. Bobcats can hop the fences and they don't hurt the vineyards. They don't really always want to be in the vineyards because there are more humans and more machines, but the bobcats and people raising chickens can't get along. So for obvious reasons. So when we look at lines of demarcation and what should be open and closed, like everything, it becomes so complicated right away that it's fascinating.
So Sarah, I'll just end on this. Of course, in the architecture world, where I reside, there's a lot of discussion about how you really do coexist with other species. And is it about boundaries? Is it about greening facades? Is it about set-asides for nature? So it's just a broader question that I think that maybe remote sensing can help us with. It's not only about these reserves or preserves, it's also what really is a challenge for cities like ours, like the city of Los Angeles.
Well, I also think that there's a very interesting set of questions about fear and perceptions of danger, and also just common sense that we expect cities to be safe from crime, right? Safe from other people's ill intents, but we then also expect cities to have the right kind of wildlife and not the wrong kind of wildlife because we're unwilling to share space, really. So people with chickens and but right? Or if you want to have a garden, you have to enclose it like a fortress, because the rabbits will eat it, the gophers will eat it. It's a predatory environment out there. And what do you do with that? Well, either you can shoot the rabbits and the bobcats, or you can say, okay, I'm sharing this space because we're coexisting in this space, and what you bring to my space, I appreciate for all kinds of other reasons. So I think that there's partly an issue of just relearning to live in places where there's other kinds of species there, and you don't let your little children out at 7 o'clock in the morning when the coyotes are walking through. I mean, it's like, excuse me, why would you do that anyway? But right.
But what's also intriguing with this is, as you're talking, I'm thinking about, each species has its own rules, meaning the bobcats have those issues. If you look at the rabbits, we have this gigantic vegetable garden, and our friends who live nearby say, why don't the rabbits eat everything? They're here. They're the size of the horses. They're so happy. I said, I think we just plant enough. There's enough for them and enough for us, because we've never had to fence it, but there's just always plenty of food. But that's a luxury answer. But each species is different, and so the formula becomes very complex right away, which simply makes it more and more interesting.
From our perspective, I interject with NAHR just enjoys articulating these questions, right? And it's very hard. None of us is trying to find the answer or a direction, but really articulate the different point of views. It's a little bit more challenging in a Zoom. Sometimes it's actually easier because none of us had to travel, so it was easy to hop in and out. But definitely when you are at the ranch or you are in the Taleggio Valley, as we started the morning talking about, to be physically in a space, I think enhance and brings the questions in a different ways. Like Sarah was saying, when you start construction, you have to be there, right? The making component also. We can't escape from the big data anymore, but John, I think, but is also the sensors, but is also being on the space. It feels very enriching. And for me, I'm not giving up to talk about the horses because the entire reasoning of the ranch are the horses, or, probably I'm asking Sarah, but I think it's a unique condition of your coexistence with them that is a lifelong commitment and expanded to retirement, which is another aspect of life, right, for all of us. And so I don't know, Sarah, if you want to give us a little bit of a hint about the horses.
Well, they weren't really part of this, except that, well, they are part of this because they're, as you said, why we were here, but I'm just going to pile them in the menagerie, meaning they were the reason that we were looking for a property where we could have the horses. And then the social circularity is that in order to afford for the two farm worker families who were here before we came to stay, we needed an income source. And then we said, okay, retired horses. So because I get paid to take care of the animals in their retirement, and that money goes to, of course, support the farm workers, and therefore we can have the gardens and the crops. So, you know, I could talk forever about that, but it becomes part of the whole picture, but not exclusive.
I also wanted to say one other thing to Jonathan about your school, the developers who are learning how to do financial pro formas and maximize return on investment. That's a school that ultimately, when you get your PhD, that's where you should be teaching, to teach them how to read landscapes in other ways. I mean, that's in terms of interdependence. If we don't begin to develop that knowledge amongst those really smart group of people, we're sort of doomed, because we need to house a lot of people, as one of our speakers in the video said. You know, we have millions of people to house, so there needs to be a sensitivity to these issues that is expanded and grown. So I hope you don't hate them too much, and you'll be willing to come back and teach.
Definitely, that's a great point.
Well, there's also building and building, right? So there's the Newhall Ranch Centennial type building, and then there's a much more careful, sensitive way of thinking and building that incorporates what Sarah has observed, and that you can actually build stuff for pretty cheap. The question is, why aren't we? And what are the codes and conventions? Again, that term that stand in the way. Now, it can be partly because those buildings are probably kind of cold in the winter and kind of hot in the summer. And we've gotten to the point where we'd like a little more comfort, but there's a middle ground there where we can suffer just a little bit more cold and suffer a little bit more heat, and do things in a more modest and parsimonious way than the codes allow today. So I think your example is really important, and I hope that people are paying attention to it, because then we can actually afford to have the housing for all the people who are so desperately poorly housed or unhoused. So I believe that after this session we have some videos, and I think that we've had an extremely rich discussion, and I want to thank our speakers very much. I've enjoyed it hugely, and I'm going to go visit Sarah, and I'm going to go ping Frank, and I know I'm going to be talking to Jonathan pretty soon. So thank you very, very much, Ilaria, and NAHR is doing really spectacular work. So thank you.